There's anger on the streets of Tbilisi. Protesters there are trying to block a so-called foreign agents law. They say it's incompatible with European values. Is this an historic fork in the road for the people of Georgia? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, divisions are appearing in the country of Georgia over a controversial bill. Its opponents say its passage would align it with Russian values and pull it away from Europe. Others point to very similar laws in the West. So, just what's at stake here for the former Soviet nation?
Tear gas and water cannon used to disperse demonstrators outside Parliament in Tbilisi. This after the contentious Foreign Agents Bill took another step closer to becoming law. The legislation would require NGOs, civil rights groups and media to register as foreign agents if more than 20% of their funding comes from abroad. The ruling Georgian Dream Party says the bill will increase transparency.
The financing of NGOs is in reality for strengthening intelligence agencies. This money has nothing to do with help. In fact, their only aim is the loss of Georgian sovereignty.
Opponents counter it'll be used to crack down on dissenting voices, similar to how comparable law is used in Russia. There are also worries it takes the country away from a path towards EU and NATO membership.
We will be there until the law drops because we know what the European values are and we choose Europe, so we will never surrender.
Top European officials have called for a de-escalation of violence, while the US says it is concerned.
The legislation and the anti-Western rhetoric of Georgia Dream's leadership has put Georgia on a precarious trajectory that jeopardizes Georgia's Euro-Atlantic path and undermines the US-Georgia relationship.
The bill is contentious with Georgian politicians too. Scuffles inside the parliament as protesters demonstrated outside. And one opposition lawmaker appeared with bandages on his face after he says he was beaten by riot police. As tensions and tempers run high, would this law force Georgia to choose between East and West?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, is Ghia Nodia, Professor of Politics at the Ilia State University. He's also a former Minister of Education and Science. In Oxford, in the UK, is Natalie Sabanadze. She's Senior Research Fellow, Russia and Eurasia Programme. That's at Chatham House. She's also the former Ambassador and Head of Georgian Mission to the European Union. And here with me in the studio is Marko Gasic. He is an International Affairs Analyst. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Natalie, I'll come to you first. Am I right in thinking this is actually the second time the Georgian government has tried to get this legislation through Parliament?
Yes, indeed. Last time, when the first attempt was exactly a year ago, in March 2023. And that time as well, there was a huge protest against this law. It was before Georgia received candidate status for the accession to the European Union. The protests, the mood was the same because it was considered that this would seriously derail Georgia's European aspirations. There was a lot of pressure on Georgian government from Western partners, the US, the EU. And at that time, the ruling party decided to back down and withdrew this bill. So we all thought, well, at least I did, the majority of people, that this would be it. There was a promise made also to interlocutors in Brussels that this law will not be revisited. And to our surprise, it came back a year later and about 6 months before parliamentary elections in Georgia.
Ghia, give us a sense of the feeling in Tbilisi and across the country. What are people saying?
Okay, I think it was a shock, of course. We also believed that this law at least would not come back, but it did. And it was, consternation, anger, and feeling that we are losing our future, basically. That with this law, Mr. Ivanishvili, who is effective leader of the country, is dragging us into the Russian world geopolitically, and also domestically, in the sense that we are going in the direction of full autocracy, or Russia having a regime similar to Russian one, because the law is basically, everybody calls it Russian law here because it's modeled on the Russian law, which was adopted in 2012 in Russia and was used for a crackdown on Russian civil society, and it was successful in that. So that's a step in direction of full autocracy. So that's why we have such huge protests and determination not to allow this to pass.
Marko, are people right to be suspicious here, seeing the hand of Russia influence, interference in other governments, or are they just being a bit paranoid? What's your reading of it?
It's probably neither of those, but I think the key thing here is that if this is a law that goes onto the statute books, if it's passed, it means that foreign financed organisations have to declare their donations and the origin of those donations. Now, that's called transparency. Now, transparency in Georgia doesn't seem to be a problem for the Russians. Why aren't they complaining about this? Why is it only the Western financed NGOs, or more accurately, perhaps FGOs, foreign government organisations, who are doing the complaining? I mean, if the Russians are behind this all, they would be the first, if they're behind an insidious campaign within Georgia to influence people, they'd be the first to complain and say, no, we don't want this thing on the statute books. They're not complaining, it's their opponents.
What's your reading of the
I would add one other thing, though.
Yeah.
That this law, which Professor Ghia says is modelled on the Russian law was modelled on the American law, which started in the 1930s. In 1938, against the Nazis to force them to declare themselves. The Americans have developed this law. The UK has also got its even more rigorous version of the same law, which applies to individuals, not just organisations. Nobody's complaining here. Why are they complaining over there?
Natalie, what have you got to say to that?
Yeah, first of all, it's not exactly the model of the FARA, so-called American law. It is modeled on the Russian law. Russians are not complaining. Russians are applauding this move of the Georgian government. It's not about transparency. It is about weaponization of transparency. Under the pretext of openness and transparency, it is going to target civil society. It is going to stifle dissent and basically free thought. We know exactly what happened in Russia. We have seen it. And the motives that drive this government are exactly the same. So this will be a real blow to free Georgia, because Georgia at the moment does have vibrant civil society. And where does it come from? That civil society and free Georgia exists because of the Western support. Most of the organizations that are working and functioning in Georgia are funded through Western agencies. And this is the target. It's not like in the American equivalent or the UK equivalent about malign influence of foreign powers that are trying to undermine stability and security of the country. It targets Georgia's friends. And those supposedly we want to join the collective West. We want to be part of the European Union and NATO. So these are our friends, not Russians. And Russians are, in this case, are particularly happy.
Ghia, why would the Georgian government want to do something that the European Union is quite clearly saying is very problematic for them?
Okay, it depends what the real priorities of the current Georgian government is. Yes, they still say that they aspire to membership of European Union, and even promises that in 2030 we will become members of the European Union. But if so, then their politics are fully schizophrenic, because they are doing exactly the opposite of what a country that wants to become a member of European Union should be doing. And it's not only that, but the justification for adopting this law is basically based on the idea that the West is our enemy, that the West is run by so-called global war party, which wants to use Georgia as cannon fodder for a war with Russia. And that's language used directly. I quote from Bidzina Ivanishvili's speech. So he made this kind of reversal that the West is now our enemy. And for some reason, we still want to join it, which does not make any sense.
Just bring you in, Marko. Before we do, I just want to read to you a tweet on X from Ursula von der Leyen this past week. The Georgian people want a European future for their country. Georgia is at a crossroads. It should stay the course on the road to Europe. I mean, she couldn't spell it out more clearly.
Well, it's a question of what she's spelling out. What she's spelling out is that the Georgian government is not allowed to pass a law that the UK government has passed in much worse form, that the American government has inspired, and which has been tried. Again, we had this in Thailand, where the Thai government tried to pass a similar law. Again, you had these rent-a-mob demonstrations which overthrew that initiative. The question is, it's not really about just Georgia, it's about the world. Is the West allowed to throw millions of pounds at NGOs, or rather their own GOs, all over the world so that they can influence the future of those countries? That's against the self-determination of those nations. That self-determination is an internal process within the country. You should not have the foreigner coming in with loads of money, putting it there so that it competes with people who don't have that money for influence in those societies. This is not a moral crusade, as the professor suggests. It's not about morality. This is an immoral attempt to enforce foreign fiat on the indigenous population and their representative government.
Let's see what Ghia has to say to that. Ghia.
Okay, indigenous population to which I belong, we made our self-determination in wishing to join the European Union, and as you mentioned, there is overwhelming support for this. And our government, which pretends to pursue the same goal, it basically undermines our chances to do this. So it is exactly against self-determination of our nation, but it's about, Mr. Ivanishvili's attempt to stay in power indefinitely. That's what he wishes. And of course, as Natalie mentioned, he is only applauded from Moscow because rupture or conflict with the West, it leaves Georgia effectively at Russia's mercy. So it's against our self-determination, independence, what our government is doing.
Natalie, do you think the European Union is very concerned about what's going on in Tbilisi right now?
Yes, and I think they should be concerned because similar law, for example, which was truly similar, it's not like the UK and the US equivalent, was passed by Hungary, and the European Court of Justice cracked it down because it considered it to be not in line with European values. These laws are not in line with European values. They have nothing to do with self-determination. On the contrary, Georgian people made their choice. And the organizations that are going to be targeted are not outside implants of some foreign influence. They are homegrown organizations. They're receiving support in order to promote democracy, rule of law, judiciary, free judiciary, independence of media, unless we think that all of this is something that Georgia doesn't want, and that is there is no evidence for it, then there is nothing imposed from outside. This is a choice that we have made. That is why Georgia wants to join the European Union, because it wants to be European-style democracy. That's 80% of the population. And in addition, speaking of self-determination and independence, in Russia's orbit, Georgia can never be free and independent. This is facade. This is what Putin uses the language when he goes around the world and says that he's fighting for freedom of nations while waging a colonial war. This is an attempt through the hands of the Georgian government to build in Georgia Russia-style governance system, which is rejected by the people. And this is the explanation, and it is entirely homegrown. Now, maybe your guest thinks that these protests have also been instigated from outside, the way, for instance, many probably would think. That's one of the one of the motives to stop funding, to basically have these groups disappear, and that not only concerns NGOs, it also concerns academic and research institutions. I was Georgia's ambassador when we signed with great fanfare Horizon agreements with the EU, Erasmus, and so on. So recipients of this kind of research funding will also have to declare themselves as agents of foreign influence. It makes no sense for the country that wants to go on the path of freedom and democracy and joining the EU.
Just come back on that then, Marko.
Okay. The people of Georgia have a right to know who is paying those organizations. They go into the media, go loudly, point fingers, make accusations. They need to know who is paying them, how much are they paying them, to what extent are they potentially under the influence of those who are paying them.
But some of
and
them
those
are
who pay them are paying them for their own interests.
charities. Save the children.
Okay.
Save the children. They're helping children.
That's why it's very important to understand that simply declaring that you're getting donations is not actually imperiling those donations. You can still get them. It's just that people want to know in an open society what you are doing and the fact that you are getting them. There's nothing wrong with allowing the world to know what your sources of finance are. That's the whole point. In the UK, political parties have to declare all donations that they get. If these organisations were operating in Washington or London, they would have to declare their foreign donations. What's so bad about a small country having the same right?
Natalie?
Well, there are plenty of ways of declaring foreign funding. Most of these organizations do. Every single project that is being funded through foreign donations is being scrutinized, very carefully selected. And there is one thing of making it known, and another thing, what this information is going to serve. What purpose will this information serve? Because it's not going to be only about, okay, I received 25% of funding, then leave me alone. No, then after the population supposedly knows that I received 25% of, I don't know, European democracy fund, then I will be declared an agent of foreign influence. I'm not an agent of foreign influence. I am Georgian organization that works for Georgia's democracy and for priorities that have been agreed with this government on the development of Georgia. Most of the funding actually has been agreed and the priorities with the government. It's a bogus pretext. As I said in the beginning, it is weaponization of transparency to use it to stifle dissent and critical thinking.
Ghia, just talk to us about the ruling party then, Georgian Dream. How popular are they now? They've been in power, 12 years? What can you see happening for this Georgian government?
Okay, they have their support. I think main root of their support is they weaponize this fear of war, that Ivanishvili presents himself as the only force that stands between Georgia joining the war with Russia, which is a fully preposterous conspiracy theory. But this conspiracy theory is main justification for introducing this law, so that it has nothing to do with transparency, really. It has everything to do with imperiling, not just imperiling, but destroying civil society, because they openly say that civil society is enemy of the country. So, of course, they are not interested in transparency only, or at all in transparency. And so they, yes, but they are quite skillful in manipulating this topic of war, and then that helps them to keep some relatively high level of popularity. And the other topic that they weaponize is they present themselves as the only protection of protectors of traditional Georgian values against invidious West, who tries to make us all gay and immoral and so on. But they are quite good at this. And their economic performance was quite okay in the last year, so they create this influence, is this impression of party of stability, basically. But of course, this is not sufficient for keeping power. Overall, their support is falling, and they cannot be sure that they can keep power in honest elections, in fair elections. And that's an additional reason why they decided, I guess, to reintroduce this law, this draft law now, because it will be easier to use different kind of suspicious methods like fraud and pressure against opponents, vote buying, etc. during elections, because the civil society will be weakened by this law.
Natalie, how problematic do you think it is for Vladimir Putin if your country does succeed in joining the EU?
Well, this has been on Georgia's agenda basically since regaining independence. This is not news for Putin. I think what is a pleasant gain for Putin is the turn Georgia is taking right now. Basically, Georgia's foreign policy priority from the first day of regaining independence through various governments, including this government until a few years ago, has been a very stubborn determination to go west, to join EU, to join NATO, and we have paid quite a considerable price for it, thanks to Mr. Putin, who clearly was opposing it. So this is nothing new, and I think Georgia was on this trajectory. There has been a great opportunity that opened up, really thanks to the bravery and sacrifice of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian fight for their independence. That gave us an opportunity to also join among the candidate countries. Basically, it was Ukraine that returned enlargement back to the European table of discussions. So this is something that is expected in Russia. What I say is unexpected, perhaps, or perhaps they have a say or a hand in it. It's a speculation from my side. I do not know exactly. But Georgia is pivoting away from the West by adopting this kind of legislation. There's also more legislation on the table, which I call a packet of Russian laws. This has to do with restricting protests. It has to do with restricting supposedly LGBTQ propaganda. This all comes in the same, it's part of the same kind of ideological narrative that is basically some of the talking points, it seems like they could have been written in Moscow, though it very much suits them. And in this global confrontation between Russia and the West, Georgia's pivot is a real gain for Russia and a loss to the West, to the EU and its partners. Because for all these years, basically Georgia's Western orientation, foreign policy orientation, could have been taken for granted. And this is no longer the case. And there is a serious domestic opposition to it. And that is domestic and it is homegrown. It's not being imposed from outside. These people are protesting for days. They're not being paid for it. They're doing it out of their determination.
Marko, can you see this law getting passed this year?
I wouldn't like to speculate that it will be passed. I wouldn't like to enter into that, but I would say that it's for the locals to know who is going to represent them, on what basis they are going to be represented. It is not for a superpower to pay throughout the world for its own tentacles expressed in soft power terms.
Which superpower are we talking about?
Well, I think we can probably guess which superpower we're talking about. It's actually a group of powers that believe they have the right to force their system onto other countries, and instead of those countries, through the work of people like the two other guests, if those are indigenous propositions being put to the people on a basis of equal exposure, that's okay.
Georgians are saying that they're having foreign influence inflicted on them via this government from literally legislation, as Natalie said, that could have been written in the Kremlin.
Well, the legislation they're complaining about was written in Washington, in the White House all those years ago. The Russians have adopted it, and the fact is that you may say there may be some slight difference in the American version as it's being updated from the one in Georgia, but the fact is a superpower seems to be entitled to make it to abolish its freedoms however it sees fit. Now, the Georgian government, if it wants transparency of its system, it appears not to be allowed to do that.
Ghia, just briefly, will this legislation get through?
We don't know. It may get through, yes. I think the government is also very determined, but it will not, the story will not end there because, as I said, it's not about transparency, it's about destroying Georgian civil society, so there will be continuing protests and continuing fight around this law. It will continue, of course, to elections and preparations for elections. So the situation is very unpredictable and unstable.
Ghia, Natalie and Marko, thank you all so much for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World, and if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.